key to life.
Hello, this is Sekou Burmese, your host of The Lit Review, a podcast brought to you by the Academy of Management Journal. In this podcast, we dive into the insights of recent research published in the journal and interview authors and corporate leaders to discuss the inspiration for research ideas and how insights from this research can apply to current pressing issues in organizations and markets. In this episode, I speak with Scott Sonenshein, the Henry Gardiner Symonds Professor of Management in the Jones Graduate School of Business at Rice University. We talk about a recent paper that he published with co-author Kristen Nault about organizational resilience. The paper explores the different ways that firms approach adversity and how these different approaches can lead to very different business outcomes. We also discuss how resilience can best be thought of as a verb and not a noun, and how leaders can think about preparing their organizations to deal with adversity. I hope that you enjoy this episode of The Lit Review and my discussion with Scott Sonenshein. My guest today on the Lit Review podcast is Scott Sonenshein, the Henry Gardiner Symonds Professor of Management in the Jones Graduate School of Business at Rice University. Scott's research employs field methodologies to explain the resourceful actions of employees to foster organizational, social, and personal change. Scott's research has won numerous awards and has been recognized by various organizations such as Michigan Center for Positive Organizations, as well as the Aspen Institute. He's also the author of two books, Stretch, Unlock the Power of Less and Achieve More Than You Ever Imagined, as well as Joy at Work, Organizing Your Professional Life with my personal savior, Marie Kondo. At Rice, Scott has won research awards more times than Taylor Swift has won Album of the Year Grammys. So we are really pleased and honored to have him. Welcome, Scott, to the Lit Review podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
I'd like to start by discussing the recent AMJ paper entitled When the Symphony Does Jazz: How Resourcefulness Fosters Organizational Resilience During Adversity. The paper follows two prominent arts organizations during this COVID-19 pandemic to understand how firms respond to adversity. So before we get into the paper, I'd like to ask, what got you interested in the topic of organizational resilience, and why did you think it was really important that we understand it better?
Yeah, so I kind of maybe modify the question a little, because as an inductive field researcher, I was not looking to study organizational resilience. Rather, I wanted to study adversity, and I didn't exactly know where the paper was going to unfold. This is going back to the early days of the pandemic, and it's March and April of 2020, and I'm sitting in my living room trying to figure out what am I going to do with my research. Even in Texas, we had lockdowns at this point as well. And I started interviewing creative types, Broadway professionals, artists, writers, and kind of it turns out they're an interesting group to spend time with, especially when you have very limited options in terms of what you can be doing. So I kind of got enamored with this idea of creative work as a context. And then the way that my process usually works is I like to study organizations as a unit of analysis. So I was talking to kind of a cross section of these different professionals. I needed to find an organization to study and how it was dealing with adversity during the pandemic. And just kind of, I guess, rather fortuitously, around that same time, I was teaching a class over Zoom, and I was doing this exercise called the reciprocity ring that Wayne Baker has come up with, and it's an opportunity where you can ask favors, and people will actually grant those favors. And I happened to be short a person in my class, so I invited my faculty assistant to participate within the class. And lo and behold, when I put my request out there, which was, "Hey, I want to study a professional arts organization. Does anyone have any contacts?" Well, it turns out she did, and she connected me with a PR person, and that kind of started a long process of getting to the first of two cases in my organization that I studied. And as I was kind of going into this process and talking with people and following them over time, because resilience, of course, and that's kind of one of the key takeaways of the paper, is something that you just can't label in the moment. You have to understand the trajectory of how an organization responds to adversity. And so this theme came out in terms of focusing on kind of the more resilient acts that this organization was taking. So to kind of get to the punch of it is, I didn't go in trying to study resilience, but that's where the data led me.
Yeah. So I like how you talk about your process, right? And being an inductive researcher, you often don't know where you're going to head, but there's something about the phenomenon that really excites you, and then that sets you along the path there.
Yeah, absolutely. And here, what we saw was a group of individuals struggling with uncertainty at unprecedented levels in one of the most difficult industries out there. The performing arts got decimated in terms of unemployment rates. Of course, during the pandemic, you couldn't have people packed into your venue. You couldn't practice on stage. I mean, here you are, not only are you very proximate physically next to each other, but you're essentially blowing air through instruments, which means you're not wearing a mask, but you're literally spreading your germs to the people around you. So there were so many challenges here. So at a kind of phenomenal level, to understand how is that these organizations are able to operate, and were they even going to survive? Because of course that was an open question during the study as well. I had no idea. I mean, this paper could have turned out very differently. It could have been about the decline of organizations and organizational death. I didn't know what the outcome was going to be, and for me, that's the really exciting part about being an inductive researcher. It's also the terrifying part, of course, because you don't know where it's going to go. And I'd not written on organizational resilience before, so it was a new literature for me. So that's really intimidating too, when you submit your paper to AMJ or any top journal, and you're playing in a literature that you haven't played with before, and you're dealing with experts on the other side. The question is, what did I miss? What's the seminal paper I really should have cited? And that's that. But again, like that part is really enjoyable for me if I kind of get over those nerves.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's good to know you also have nerves, despite
I got plenty of nerves. Let me tell you.
All right, so let's talk about the central kind of takeaways, right? So in tracking these organizations and looking at how they adjust and respond to adversity, what do you think was the key takeaways from your paper?
Yeah, so I think on the resilient side, I think this goes to an axiom that Carl Weick likes to talk about, which is to really stamp out nouns and replace them with verbs. And for me, that was a big part of unlocking what was going on at these organizations. And what I mean by that is it's hard to talk about organizational resilience as a static state. It's essentially a process of adversity adjustment. And that process can take on very different cadences. So in one of the two organizations that we studied, it was a pretty, upward linear trajectory of positive adjustment where, they started almost from the very beginning of the pandemic in terms of how they were going to respond, what they were going to do, the resources that they created and mobilized. And, they kind of hit it out of the park. Other organization took a very different trajectory, and at times, actually, even in the middle of the review process, I actually thought the organization was going to die, and then it had this turnaround. So I think the first thing is to understand resilience more as a process. So I like to talk about resiling or acts of resilience, and to think about it as a verb. The second big finding is this intersection of research on organizational resilience and resourcefulness, which is something that I did know about before coming into the study. And what we find is that there were two very different types of resourcefulness that the organizations were taking. One was more promotive, so drawing off of that regulatory focus theory and kind of applying it to more of an org theory type construct, and looking at how organizations might more proactively and opportunistically approach adversity in ways that create resources like trust or agency in the sense of employees, and how that allows them to adjust in really positive ways to the adversity. Whereas this second organization started more from a preventative focus, where the uncertainty was terrifying to them, and they didn't know what they were going to do. And so they decided, well, we're gonna shut down, we're gonna mothball the organization until this pandemic blows over in a few months. So of course, it's a lot more than a few months, and that mentality constricted the way that they were able to think about their resources. So they massively cut costs and saw their employees as cost centers, not as creators that might actually find novel ways of producing revenue like the first organization did.
One of the things that I love about your telling of this story and kind of pulling it together is beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Resources are in the eye of the beholder, so to a certain extent. And so in one organization, they looked at one resource, like you said, employees as a cost that we need to minimize. And another saw it as, well, this can be the engine. These can be kind of value creators to help us through this. And oftentimes that's just seeing things differently, right? Versus some kind of material difference.
Yeah, because these were the way the sampling worked on this study is they were matched as closely as we possibly could. They were in very similar political environments, democratic states, in democratic cities and Republican states with very similar local COVID regulations. They had similar resource stocks at the beginning. I mean, which is to say that in this industry, they were struggling financially, like most performing arts organizations are. Similar prestige levels. So all of that was similar, but the way that they thought about and enacted their resources and created their resources were so dramatically different, even though they're facing the same crisis, the same adversity, same type of talent, same just about everything. And it was really remarkable to watch these two diametrically opposed paths try and respond to this crisis with very different outcomes, at least for the first year of the study.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Was there anything that surprised you as you were kind of undertaking this, even something that maybe didn't end up in the paper, but something that struck you or challenged an assumption maybe you had about how resiliency or adversity worked?
Yeah, so there was a bunch of surprises. I think whenever you spend a few years in the field during such a strong context like the pandemic, a lot of stuff is going to be there. One of them did make it into the paper, and that's this part that I was alluding to, where Kristen and I really thought that this second organization was going to go bankrupt, and it looked like lights were out essentially. And at points, and this isn't reflected in the paper because things changed, this was really not so much a paper of two organizations acting resiliently, but one acting resiliently and one barely surviving. Kind of reviewers push back on, well, do you call that resilience? Do you not call that resilience? And that kind of became a moot point as the review process unfolded, because time unfolded at the same time. And this organization, the second organization, had this dramatic U-turn. And so we bring in this construct from sense making called updating, and how the organization was able to update its assumptions about its resources, update its kind of emotional understanding of what was going on. And did this dramatic turnaround. And that became an important part of the paper that really didn't evolve until after the first round of reviews. That emotional part, I mean, is really important because as kind of a human, anyone kind of studying resilience cannot help but to feel connected to the people that you're talking with, and trying to empathize and understand the plight that they're in. And here we are talking to musicians, people who have been playing these instruments since maybe they were 5 years old, and they're now in their mid 30s, late 30s, early 40s. They've been doing this their entire life essentially. And here they are struggling to find venues to play their instruments. They can't practice with their colleagues. And there were a couple of people in our sample at this second organization that essentially they had no ways of sustaining themselves. They had to sell their instruments. And it was really sad just hearing these stories about these world-class musicians who have worked so hard to get to where they are, to then feel like they have no choice but to sell their instruments. And that was really deeply disturbing to us. And, at this point, the updating and the big turnaround at the second organization had not happened. So, it's kind of one of those things that as a field researcher, it's sometimes hard to separate who you are as a person from trying to stay objective as a researcher.
Oh, man, I can only imagine. That's so my younger brother's a musician, and I couldn't imagine him ever having to sell his pianos, plural, because he needed to. So this also probably resonated with me because I remember being worried about him. Like, are you going to be able to eat? What are you going to be able to do? And he was kind of resilient, which actually brings up an interesting question. I wanted to get your take on this. Organizational resilience is a word that's tossed around, and I think people use it in a bunch of different ways. I find that sometimes resilience is thought of as surviving a really terrible time. Like, we made it, we were resilient, we exist, right? The second organization sounds like this. You were worried they may not make it, and so an organization will go through, almost seem like they're going to be out of business, survive barely, and it's like they were resilient, versus this other org, which I don't want to say was thriving, but was doing maybe better than expected. In your view, are those both the same? Are those people resiling? What was the verb? I want to
Resiling.
make sure. Resiling. Are those two organizations resiling? Would you consider them in the same category, or are those separate things?
Yeah, you kind of sound like a reviewer on this paper. Someone who's read the first decision, because that was one of the questions that the reviewers had, which were all, they were all outstanding reviewers, and they asked some really hard questions, and that was one of them. Like, where do we draw the boundaries around what this construct is? Because you've described two separate organizations, one, thriving in quotes, the other barely getting by. And is that second one really, really resiling because they're decimated? They're still a going concern. They're still operating, but they've gotten rid of so much of their staff. They're not playing. They've lost their purpose. How can we call this resiling? And so there was a lot of kind of back and forth about, how do we respond to that? And ultimately, where we landed on is to not think so much about this construct of organizational resilience as binary, but really to think about it as a continuum around adversity adjustment. Mm-hmm. And the closer you get to you're coming out stronger from that adversity, that's resiling. The fact of simply just hanging on and surviving, that might be adversity adjustment. I would put the line on resiling above that.
Okay.
Of course, I think that there might be just debates over where exactly do we place that boundary? Where the second organization was in that first year, after having the benefit of going through and finishing this paper and learning a lot from the reviewers during this process, I think that original characterization we had was wrong. I don't think that simply hanging in there and surviving, even though your organization was decimated, was resiling. It's still adversity adjustment, and you're still doing, better than a lot of other organizations. But resilience and acting resiliently seems to be in a different category.
Yeah. All right. I think so that I believe I was along those lines, but I appreciate your insights on that. All right. So expanding out a bit and thinking about managers, right? And so what you described is something that I think is still the nightmares of many leaders for organizations today, right? Thinking about, what happens when we face another potential problem? And I want our organization to be resilient. I want us to be able to overcome these adversity. What suggestions would you have for, leaders that are trying to think about, how do I build this capacity in my organization?
Yeah, so I think it really starts to what we discovered early on in the research, which separates these two organizations. Because if you think about the environment they were in, not just as people who were working, but just as in people, one of the things that major adversity does to us, it takes away our sense of control. And leaders, I think, especially feel that because, they have their personal lives, but they also have the responsibility for running these complex organizations. And we saw two very different approaches at the beginning of the adversity. In the kind of thriving organization, they embraced uncertainty, and leaders were very clear and said, look, we don't know what the answer is. We don't know how this thing is going to turn out, but what we do know is, we're not going to shut down, and we're going to just go ahead and try and figure things out on the fly. They were very uncomfortable, and this is kind of where the title of the paper comes from, when the symphony does jazz, because this is an organization, if you think about the way a symphony is structured, it looks like a traditional bureaucratic organization. It is full of structure. It's got the formal leader and the conductor. You've got your different layers of musicians. They're playing off of scripts and routines. That's sheet music. And they're looking for a repetition of performance. They're looking for, the Saturday night show to be just like the Sunday matinee. And that's kind of like how we generally teach classic organizations. So to imagine you now find yourself in an environment where there's so much uncertainty, you got to rip up the sheet music, you got to destroy the hierarchy, and you got to embrace, instead of planning 2.5 years in advance, you're planning 2 weeks in advance. Yeah. And it's kind of not fearing that uncertainty and embracing improvisation. I think that really made the difference for this, which for, again, a lot of leaders used to the comforts of predictability and control. That's something really hard to do. It's something that the second organization struggled with. And I think it's something that many organizations during the pandemic and other types of adversity also struggle with.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned White once, so I'll tell you what came to my mind is about tools, right? And the dropping of the tools allegory. And so saying like, all right, we have our ways, our routines, to be able to say we're going to do away with those and do something new, immediately conjured up kind of that idea, which I think might also be applicable to this situation.
Yeah, no, very much so. I mean, and I would just modify that a little and say they had to drop their instruments at one point because, the piano player or the trumpet player, also had to, figure out how to do with marketing, right? And kind of how do you readjust your job roles and responsibilities when it's all hands on deck. So definitely dropping the tools, definitely dropping the instruments.
All right, you're building on it. All the people in Michigan, I'm sure, were proud to see that. Building on that and kind of expanding out. So one of the things that I noted in your paper is your definition of organizational resilience. And I know this is where you ended up, but I thought it was important to kind of hit on this. You define it as the maintenance of positive adjustments under challenging conditions. And the idea of positive adjustments, I think, is really important and really kind of interesting. You can talk about that, but I do want to connect this to positive and positivity and positive organizations in general, right? So you are a faculty affiliate of the Center for Positive Organizations at Michigan, where you have some links as well. This idea of studying positive versus negative adjustment and, positive organizations. Do you think that approach is useful, or how? I know you think it is. How do you think this approach can be useful to understanding how organizations operate and behave?
Yeah, so I would just clarify that I don't think this is an either or situation. This is a both and situation. And so positive organizations is trying to shine a spotlight on underexplored mechanisms that try and focus on not just ordinary behavior, but extraordinary behavior. So if you want to study resilience and that maintenance of positive adjustment under challenging conditions, we can look at one of these cases and say they were absolutely thriving. They're on the far right end of the spectrum because of what they did. But to understand why what they did was so remarkable, it actually was really important to understand the second case. And this was a case that essentially almost dragged the organization into bankruptcy. And so there was a lot of struggle there. So I don't think you can study one without studying the other. But what I think positive organizations is calling attention to is, well, if you want to understand the full spectrum of how organizations and people are operating, you can't just focus on negative stuff. You've got to also focus on positive. So for me, they're really just kind of different sides of the same coin. And so, even in this paper, you see plenty of stuff around struggle, around lack of trust, mistrust in the second case. And it helps clarify and elucidate what's happening in the other case.
No, I think that's very well said. In talking to my own students, and they all like to refer to me. They refer to some amazing case like, oh, this company's doing this. And I'd love to know how to do this like this company. And I say, okay, well, that's great. Have you found a company that is trying to do the same thing, but not doing it well? Right. And try to find that competing case, because otherwise you have sometimes people developing these rules and lay theories about how to get something done by only looking at one type. And so I like the idea of the balance. So that's great. So last set of questions here before I let you go. So much of our research in our field is based on kind of phenomena that we observe, but don't always understand fully. And it sounds like this very much is a way that you dive into new projects. And so what are some of the things that are piquing your curiosity these days?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things. I've been very interested recently in the criminal justice system and thinking about the intersection of that and resourcefulness. Think about a population that society has collectively written off and the lack of employment opportunities that people have who are formerly incarcerated. So I'm in the midst of a pretty big data collection with an organization right now that is essentially taking people who are incarcerated felons and placing them in high status, high paying tech jobs. And it's a remarkable transformation about going from not having enough money to pay your bus fare, leave prison, to making several $100,000s working for some of these iconic tech brands. And I think, programs like this and ways of trying to find those pockets of hidden resources in places where you would least likely think you would find them is something that I'm especially interested in right now, and I'm very much interested in also thinking about AI and artificial intelligence right now and how that's going to change the world of work. I haven't started anything in that area, but it's certainly something that I've been thinking a lot about recently.
Yeah, well, I mean, the topic of incarcerated individuals in the labor market is also one that's near and dear to my heart, right? Thinking about ways that organizations are maybe inadvertently or sometimes advertently leaving them out, while at the same time there's a shortage, right, in a lot of kind of areas. And so there are ways that maybe we can address this gap. And that's good research, but it's also really good for society in general. So that's great. I'm very curious to see when you finish with that data collection, what you find. Additionally, what are you reading for fun? Just for leisure, nothing related to work? Just I kick back and I enjoy reading what?
Well, right now I'm in the middle of a book called Outlive. It's on the science of longevity, and I guess I'm just getting to the age where that's a little more top of mind.
Talking about resilience, the living a long time. So is this like this is not a fiction, this is a nonfiction book about like the science of aging and the like. So what have you learned thus far? What tips are there? Please tell me drinking coffee is not bad, because otherwise
no, that's fine. But maybe cutting down on the wine. So.
Oh no. Well, is there a workaround? Let's get to the end of the book. Let
me finish and get back to you on that one.
If you say cut down on wine, wow. Well, how long do I really want to live? No. Thanks again, Scott. Appreciate you taking the time to talk about this really important and valuable research. I want to encourage all listeners to check out this article. There's also been a couple of really great write-ups on this that I'll also make sure I post. And check out Scott's other stuff. He's got a lot of things in the hopper and a lot of things cooking. I always learn something when I read your research, which I appreciate. So thank you.
Oh, well, thank you for having me.
All right, that's it for the Lit Review. I appreciate Scott for his time, and I appreciate you all for listening. If you like this episode, I invite you to subscribe to the Lit Review podcast. You can find us by searching The Lit Review and AMJ podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and other podcast platforms, as well as on the AMJ homepage. You can follow us on Twitter, where there's a weekly Twitter Spaces show called AMJ Radio Live. It's hosted on the AOM Connect on Twitter Spaces. Thanks to Academy of Management for their support for this podcast. Special thanks to my producer, Holly Fearing, for all of her work behind the scenes. Our theme music is produced by Key to Life. This is Sekou Burmese, and I'll see you next time. Take care and be good.
Key to Life.